So it seems to work. So I start sharing my screen. So can you all see the screen? I hope so.
Yes, we do.
Very good. So welcome all to this webinar today about methane trait definitions and the consequences for breeding programs. We have two presentations today, and you will see the agenda just right in the next two slides. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. So there will be two presentations. So we will allow for one or two quick questions after each presentations, but then we will have time for discussion afterwards. And if there are any questions in between already, so you can also place them in the chat and the speakers could already answer there, or you could speak up then in the discussion as well. So just very briefly, a short background for this webinar that we are having today is that within the Global Methane Genetics Initiative, we have started a project about the development of a framework for the adoption of and the incentivization and as an incentivization system for genetic selection as a methane mitigation tool. And this project basically has three important pillars that you can see in those three boxes here on this slide. So where the first one is about to set up an open source protocol for validation of methane breeding values within and across regions. Here it is about to identify bottlenecks and best practices and to develop a protocol for the adoption of national and foreign breeding values. The second one in the middle, so here it's all about the different trait definitions that are currently being heavily discussed in the community, and what are the different implications of different trait definitions for the selection index work and breeding objective. And then the third one is about reviewing different policy levers and market mechanisms, major carbon calculators and the required input for this. So here it's to identify the related stakeholders and provide social maps relevant for animal breeding in the different countries. For all those three pillars or topics, we have a webinar scheduled, so where we have the first one today. But for the other two topics, you see that there are webinars scheduled in the beginning of May. And we will have a specific ICA session in Verona, at the ICA meeting in Verona, where it's more will be presented about this topic on adoption and incentives to breed for methane mitigations. So yeah, coming to the topic for today. My slide is not changing. Now it works good. So for today, as I said, so we have two speakers. The first one is Mark Rutten, from a colleague from Wageningen University Research, and he is working on selection index calculations, showing a little bit the consequences of using ratio traits in selection indices. Ratio traits is a very important topic here when it comes to methane trait definitions, when we think of methane intensity, so methane produced per kilogram of milk or per kilogram of dry matter intake. And then his presentation will be followed by a presentation from Julius van der Werf from the University of New England in Armidale in Australia. And he will be talking about the effect of including methane traits in selection indexes for ruminants. And then after the presentations, we would have some almost half an hour time for discussion and to answer any questions that you might have. And just to reinforce, so the aim is really here to get feedback from the audience, from you as well here, what your experience is about, including different trait definitions in the selection index for methane, and basically get your feedback and see what can be improved. And with this, I stop sharing and I will hand over to Mark. Mark, you can just share your screen.
Yeah, I will.
Presentation.
If you can see it, let me know.
Yes, we see it.
Okay, thank you. So I will be talking about using ratio traits in selection indices, and in the context, I think of as Brigger said, in methane traits definitions, it's very important and has been discussed quite a bit recently. Traditionally, I think a lot of pros and cons have been mentioned for using ratio traits in selection indices. Basically, using ratio traits is easy to understand for farmers and end users. So there's an interest perspective from the industry. And if we think about the context of methane, I mean, you can define methane as direct production, but also as a ratio with per product definition, or per head, or per farm, or per anything. The cons have been it's difficult to predict the response of component traits, especially if you have more traits in the index and in the breeding goal. That's also because economic values are difficult to derive if you have several traits next to a ratio trait in the breeding goal. And it's likely not optimal. The response is likely not optimal economically. So the theory how a ratio trait can be included in an index is available. It has been developed many years back, but that was only for the ratio trait. So it's one breeding goal setting where only the ratio trait was included. And from that, the advice was basically classically not to use ratio trait because of the fact that it's difficult, as I mentioned before. So now Julius van der Werf has developed tools where you basically derive genetic parameters of all the parameters for a ratio trait based on the underlying component traits. And that basically allows us to explore the mechanics of using ratio traits in selection indices. And also Julius has compiled basically a paper in which he's going to present in the WC Galp conference, where the theory and the derivations of the genetic parameters for ratio traits are presented. So if they think about ratio traits in selection indices, what can be done if you think about the component traits is to use both underlying traits, and I call them trait 1 and trait 2, abbreviated as T1 and T2 during the presentation. Or we can have a breeding goal and index as in the second line here, as one trait defined as trait 1 divided by trait 2, and probably the economic value or the value, the weight will be different, right? So we have three values here for the breeding goal and index with 2 traits. We have value 1 and 2, and then for the other one we have value 3. And in this context, the central question is, what are the consequences of these choices in the context of index selection? I mentioned already that it's difficult and complicated to derive the genetic parameters based on component traits, and the main metrics that are important here are the coefficient of variation of both traits, so trait 1 and trait 2, and lambda, which is defined as the ratio of those two coefficient of variations. And lambda can be defined on a phenotypic level, but also on a genetic level, and I have presented that here. So you see the variance for the additive genetic effect for trait 1 divided by the variance, additive variance for trait 2. And you see when, and this has also been described previously in the paper by Julius, that when lambda is smaller than 1, the denominator trait, so in this case trait 2, is dominant in the response. So when lambda changes, you see that the response in both underlying traits shifts from one trait to the other. To give you a little bit of an idea of what lambda means in practice, I've stated in the bottom lines here two trade combinations. So in the first, we have an example where feed intake is divided by average daily gain in beef, and then you end up with an estimated lambda value of 0.76, which is close, well, in the direction of 1. And the bottom line is methane production divided by milk. And then if you do the calculations, you come to a lambda value of 0.2. So there's quite a bit of difference, but this is a little bit to give you some perspective in the presentation when different values of lambda are presented. So to give you an idea of what happens when you apply selection, we came up with the basic scenario, which is actually quite simple. So we have two traits with equal heritability, no genetic correlation, and we have lots of information. So basically, the accuracy is close to 1. And to make it even more easy for us, we've set the selection intensity to 1, so that we only have to consider basically the response in the traits from the genetic standard deviations. So I will run you through these graphs I have presented in this way. So you see 5 sets of blocks here from the left to the right, representing selection response in 3 traits. So the light blue one is, or the gray one, sorry, is T1. The light blue one is trait 2, and then trait 1 divided by trait 2 is the blue one. And if you go from the left to the right in the graph, you see that in the bottom that lambda changes from lambda equals 4 to lambda equals a quarter, which I just mentioned. This is roughly representing methane in this case. This is a green goal where we have the 2 component traits represented. And when we apply selection, basically the whole scenario is what we expect, right? So we have constant response in both traits, and near constant response in the ratio trait, which is the dark blue columns. What you see is that for lambda 1, we have the most response. And if you go to either the left or the right side to lambda is 4 or lambda is 0.25, you see that the response is a little bit less. And this is basically the consequence of how genetic parameters are for the ratio traits are derived from the component traits, which have some nonlinear components in there. So that's why you probably see the curve. So if we move to breeding goal, we have where we have a ratio trait. Actually, this is what happens. What you see is that, again, going from the left to the right, you see that the response in the component traits indeed shift from emphasis on trait 1 to emphasis on trait 2 when you move from lambda is 4 to lambda is 0.25, as was mentioned in one of the first slides. But now basically we have a tool to really explore these situations and see actually in practice what happens. Due to the fact that the difference in the response between the first and the second traits remains the same from the left to the right, you see that the response in the ratio trait, so the dark blue columns, is constant over from the left to the right. So moving a little bit to a more maybe practical scenario where we have less information for trait 1. So in this case, if we think about a methane trait, there's some measurements around in some countries, but not as much as, for instance, milk, as we considered in this case. So in the next 2 slides, we have basically the same graphs as before, but now with less information for trait 1. And you see that actually the response in trait 2 mostly is lower because of the fact that you have less information. And also you see that the response in the ratio trait moves a little bit to the right. So you see that for lambda is 4, response a little bit lower, but if you go to lambda is 0.5 or 0.25, the response is a little bit bigger. So indeed, if you have a breeding goal with 2 traits in here, The response in the component trait stays the same, but also, or again, response in lambda changes from lambda S4 to 0.25. And this is the same picture for the ratio trait. So there's less information for trait 1, but it still moves from the emphasis moves from trait 1 to trait 2 if you move from lambda S4 to lambda S 0.25. So the first two sets of comparisons, I said that the correlation was close to 0. So now basically we came up with a scenario where the genetic correlation is 0.5. And what you see is that, again, there's more difference here in the blue columns, where the ratio trait basically again moves a little bit to the right, as we saw before, but now also the response is a little bit lower. Also, the genetic correlation between the component traits is part of the derivation for the genetic parameters for the ratio traits, so it has consequences for the response you expect. If you move to the ratio trait, you see that actually it becomes more difficult to have animals that have favorable breeding values for both traits. And you see that actually in the where lambda is 4, you see that both underlying traits are now negative in direction. And if you move to the right, you see that both underlying traits are positive. Still, the ratio trait is itself is constant, as you would expect, because it's this in this case it's the breeding value, or sorry, the breeding goal. So here in the next slide, I will basically compare the sets of scenarios I had, but now for a situation where lambda is 0.25. So basically, this could be a representation of the methane trait, as I mentioned in one of the first slides. And you see that if you go from a basic situation to a low information setting for trait 1, you see that the response in the first trait, so this is basically the middle set of columns, and you see that the gray bar is definitely less, it gives less response, but you see that trait 2 basically is still the same. And that basically has no consequences for the response in the ratio trait. If you move to the right set of columns, you see that this is where the correlation is 0.5, that both underlying traits are closer together because it's difficult to separate them basically. Now this is basically the last set of graphs I have in this presentation, where we again consider the ratio trait, going from the basic situation on the left to the low information setting for in the middle. You see that both underlying traits are now suffering from less information, and actually also the ratio trait gives less response here. And if you move to the right, you see that actually here in this setting, as I explained before, is that the underlying traits are now both in a positive direction, where you would probably want to have methane in a negative direction to have a response where the trait mean goes down. Interestingly, you see that in the dark blue columns that the underlying or the ratio trait, the response is still the same. So in conclusion and summary, the simulation tool is very helpful to explore the mechanisms of selection on ratio traits. Yuli's paper has some derivations in there where you see that it's relatively complicated to get to these traits, and it has consequences for how the response basically is defined. And you see that back in the graphs I showed you, that it's not always as I directly would have expected that the response would come out. Using a breeding goal with a ratio trait, the response, as I showed in the underlying trait, depends heavily on lambda. Lambda is a given, right? So we have to see if you have a set of traits what lambda is, and that basically directs the response you will get. Using a ratio trait and a component trait is basically equivalent if including the selection criterion. And including ratio traits and indices is difficult to derive economic values. And it's also difficult if you want to work with a desired gains approach. And this is basically because in practice, often, it's not only the ratio trait, of course, that is in the index and the breeding goal, but there's several traits which all are, correlated to each other, which makes the derivation for a single unit in one trait very difficult to derive. That's basically what I wanted to share, what we have done so far. Thank you for your attention. And as Birgit already mentioned, there's this continuation of this work, which will be presented in the ICAR conference in Verona. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Mark. We allow for one quick question. Someone would like to speak up? There is one question in the chat that we could already take now from Kim Matthews. Would you like to speak up? I can also read it.
Hi, yes, sorry,
Okay.
I'm multitasking. So Mark, it seems you derived the genetic parameters for the ratio, the parameters from the underlying traits. And I wonder if your findings would be different if the genetic parameters for the ratio trait were derived directly from the population.
Yeah, that's a good question. My first answer
Mark,
would
I'm
be,
happy to answer that because I just looked at it.
okay.
That's okay.
Go
Can
ahead.
you hear
Yes.
me, or?
No, go ahead, Julius.
Yeah, the answer is it's indeed the same. So I looked at an example where feed conversion rate was estimated from the data, but you could also derive it from the component traits, and basically you get the same answers. So that's the answer to your question. I have one comment on the conclusions of Mark. The third one, I'm not sure that was very clear to everyone, but a lot of that past work was what happens if you select on a ratio trait. But of course, in reality, we select on the ratio trait and often the component trait as well. So we would select on maybe methane intensity, but also milk production, which is the component trait intensity. And so the equivalence that Mark talked about is between those indexes. So whether you do the two component traits or the ratio and the component traits is actually giving you the same result. And it's fairly important because we talk quite a bit about our ratios put you in the wrong direction, but it could put you in the right direction if you add a component trait. But I think the last comment that Mark made is probably more important. It's very hard to derive proper economic values if you have ratio traits in your breeding objective. So therefore, it's hard to get proper weights. So we're not recommending ratio traits, but that's mainly because it gets too complicated to optimize it properly.
Thank you very much, Julius. I think we move on. And thanks again, Mark. And Julius, would you share your screen now?
Okay, get a lot of people that want to be admitted. Share, does it work?
Not yet.
There's too many people in the lobby that annoy me. I push on share. Sorry. Well, nothing seems. Am I allowed to share? Nothing seems to happen.
You should be allowed to share.
Yeah. Well, there's a button called share, and I click on it, nothing happens.
Can you quickly send it through so we can share it? In the meantime, there is a comment or question from Donna that we can take until the presentation has arrived at my end. So Donna, you could also speak up if you want.
But it's probably easier to understand my writing than to understand my accent, Birgit. But I guess ratio traits are more prone to genotype by environment interactions, given could potentially have a change in the variances as well as a change in the covariances across time.
So why do you think they are more prone to G by E?
Because the more nutritional or age effects. So in beef, if we're looking at growing cattle, I suspect the genetic variance will be lower relative to mature animals. So there'll be a change in the two variance components.
Okay.
But also in the denominator, but also the effect of diet. There's some Danish work now showing the effect of Bovaer and its impact on variance components.
But that's a more general point, isn't it? Like if you have different environments, then trait parameters change in general. Correlations between traits, traits variances, traits heritabilities. That in the pig world, they have done it for many years. Like the relation between feed intake and growth depends very much how you feed them. If it's ad lib or restricted. So that's a general thing, isn't it? So if you have different environments, you might have different parameters for different ratio traits because the correlation between them is not one. But again, I would just say we have total equivalence with just linear indexes with the component traits, and also there we can have different traits in different environments. So I think selection index framework captures all that.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have it already or not?
No, it's not here yet.
It's far away from here. I don't know why my share doesn't work today. It's weird.
Can I make a comment on the G by E issue?
Go ahead, Gil.
Yes, I'm from South Africa. We find that things like heat stress influence the feed intake of different animals differently. So some animals will reduce their feed intake, other animals will eat slower, other animals won't eat at all. So I think G by E can have a very important effect on something like methane-related traits, which is dependent on the intake of the animals. Thank you.
We can now see your screen, Gil. Julius.
Okay, that's good. So I'll put this thing up. Okay, I want to start here. Okay, so thanks, Mark. And basically, I'm going to talk just about linear indexes. We have a whole discussion, and we can put it in a longer paper more clearly, maybe why ratios are not such a good idea. They're not necessarily wrong, but they're just more complicated. So we have a perfect selection index framework where we just put the trace as you measure, and we can do what you like. So we're gonna. So if we want to select for low methane, we need three things. We need phenotypes to see if we can build EBVs, and genetic parameters to see how the EBVs for methane are correlated to the other traits. And then we can look at an optimum selection index. So what is our objective? What is the index? So the index is just weights times EBVs. And importantly, and in this is how we communicate it to breeders, because of course scientists might say we need linear traits, but breeders might like residual traits or ratio traits. So we have to think how to overcome that discussion. So before we measured methane, and some indexes have already been developed, they're called sustainability indexes, but they're actually not using any data on methane. So you can still put methane in the breeding objective and just not measure it, and then the EBV is, if you know correlations, the EBV could be estimated from correlated traits. But what's more often done is, or what's done at the moment in quite a few dairy indexes, that the weight of a trait is an economic weight of the trait, and then it's adjusted by the carbon price times the effect of that trait on methane. So, for example, if milk yield has a certain economic value, but every liter of milk causes so much methane and so much carbon, you just multiply it by the carbon price, and so you kind of reduce the economic weight for milk a bit because of its effect on carbon. And that's actually equivalent than putting carbon directly in the breeding objective and not correcting that economic value. But we have to move on because we have measured methane and we can do more than just letting it be a correlated response trait. We can actually actively select whether we get more data. So once we have breeding objectives, we have to define the breeding once we have EBVs, we have to define the breeding objective, so which traits. And I'm going to talk mostly about using methane production per animal as you measure it. And the previous questions, like should we use methane intensity, methane yield, I will ignore now a bit because based on the previous presentation, you can see that that's not always the best approach. So I'm going to work with this. So how do we weigh the traits? Do we use economic values? And we often see that carbon doesn't have enough economic value yet to actually make any difference. So do we then do desired gains and just double the economic weight? And also, how do we, what's the perspective that we look at? Do we need a cap on emissions? Like we had indexes for milk quota in the 80s in Europe. We have milk quota, and suddenly the indexes changed that accounted for that you could actually not increase the total amount of milk. And something like that could, of course, happen with methane as well. So that's very related to what perspective are you optimizing methane and productivity per animal, per farm, or per hectare. And there's a lot of detail and literature in the past about breeding objectives. And usually on the long term, you kind of want to optimize things per unit of product. So both the profit, but also the methane output. And that would be methane intensity. But I want to point out there's a difference between an ultimate goal of decreasing methane intensity versus putting methane intensity in itself in an index. You can just have a linear index and still aim for a methane intensity as an end goal. But because productivity is important, you just don't want just methane intensity as a ratio trait end goal. Okay, let's. The idea of this ICAR paper that we're preparing is to look at case studies for 3 species: sheep, cattle, beef cattle, and dairy. I'm only going to talk about sheep today, but and not a lot of what I say is more general. It's not specific sheep, but I have some numbers that I did for sheep. So we can look at what if methane is measured or what if it's not measured, and what's the effect on what you can achieve. So basically, if you have a population of breeding animals and you want to select from them, they have all usually a dollar index, which is basically the sum of all the traits related to productivity and what you have. So there's a current index, and then in addition, you can have a methane EBV. And typically what you are likely to go to see is that there will be correlation between the two. So this is a case where methane is not measured, but you can still have a methane EBV because if you know the correlation with production traits, you can work out EBVs for methane. If you do that, you get typically quite high correlations between the methane EBV and the index. So if this is a population of animals you have to select from, and if you ignored methane, you would just pick the top animals there. I think I have that in the next slide. So you pick the green animals here. And you see then that the response will be that methane will go up. And the response to selection is $4 per year. So this is a sheep example. The point is that index goes up, but methane also goes up because that correlation is high. And that's partly because it's not measured. So it's similar to also if you yeah, if you then selected for it, this is what you'll find. So what's important here is in general in selection index and in selection is what is the variance and the covariance between the EBV that you deal with, and you can do it in a picture if you have two trades. So if you have more information on methane, you would get more variation, so it would be more spread out, but it also would be less correlated to the index. And so the variance covariance is really the ellipse that you can imagine around here that determines where you could go. And then where you want to go depends on what you find important. So that's the economics of it. So the variation EBV and the correlation between EBVs determines the shape of that curve. So if you did measure methane, you would have a lower correlation between methane and the index. And the reason is that, so if you had perfect information on all traits, the correlation would be the genetic correlation, but the less information you have on methane, the higher the correlation will be with the index. Now, the idea is to work this out for the three main species of ruminants. And of course, every country has different systems and different parameters, so that correlation is not generic. It might be lower in some cases, but I think it's always going to happen that the correlation will be higher if you have less information on methane. So you see here, even if you did not value methane in the index, it's still possible to select some animals that have lower methane and still a high index compared with this one. Here, if you select high index, they will always have high methane. Here it's a bit less, and then the correlated response to methane is not as high in the wrong direction. So that's already an example, even if you did not measure methane. If you did, did not weigh methane. If you did give methane an economic value, and I have here a quite high carbon price, because I said already, if the shape of the slope of this line kind of is the ratio of the index versus the carbon price. So if the carbon price is 0, we'd have a line like here. If the carbon price is infinitely high, we would have a line like this. So the steeper that slope, the higher the carbon price. So a carbon price of about $40 that we have nowadays wouldn't do a whole lot compared with having no carbon price. So that's why I chose 400. But what you see here is that you could have less, if you select the individuals above that line. Sorry, I couldn't put it green quick enough before we start today. So you have less response in the wrong direction for methane, but you also lose a bit of profit because you have to balance those two traits. But this is again for high correlation. If the correlation is a bit lower because you have more information on methane, then you could actually achieve a similar response in profitability of product traits, outputs, with less carbon per animal. So again, the balance that you find between selecting for index and selecting for methane depends on two things. First, what is the correlation between those two traits? And that correlation is not just determined by the by the genetic correlation, but it's also determined by how much information you have for each of those traits. So again, if you had perfect information, this correlation would be equal to the genetic correlation, but with less information on methane, it would go more towards 1. And you can also see that the lower the correlation, the more you're able to actually select for methane without compromising too much on index. So those are important principles that we have to work out for our indexes, I think. So this is a more extreme value of $800 a ton. So I've shown the ellipse. That's what the index selection index would predict that you get. And you see here, the higher the carbon price you put, the lower you can go. The numbers are a bit different than the previous slide because I think I have a bit less information here for methane. But the point that I want to make is that at some point, the desired gains that you put on methane can be driven by just putting the carbon price higher. But at some point, you just lose too much on productivity and you get not very productive animals anymore. The gain for productivity will be a lot lower. So there will be a sweet spot of what the desired gains type index would give you. And that depends a bit how important you find this number, like how much carbon every animal produces, versus this number of how much gain do we get every year to increase productivity. So how about methane intensity? That's often supposed to be the ultimate goal, we think. Let's talk a bit about that. But also let's talk a bit about the perspective, like do we optimize it per head, per hectare, per kilo of product, or in New Zealand they optimize it per dry matter intake for some reason. So what does it all mean? So there's some results from some work on Australian sheep. And I kind of showed this already. I just had a few more trades originally, but basically, if you use a carbon price of $40, the methane production per animal, per breeding ewe, that is, including what its lambs produce. But if you have so many 100 ewes in a flock, you have a certain amount of methane output, and you can calculate it per breeding ewe. But you also gain profitability because animals become more productive. So what's interesting now is, although many people will think, oh, that's not good, methane shouldn't go up. The methane intensity here, you can calculate from the model of your farm or flock, or even for your country if you want. The methane intensity, which is how much CO2 equivalent you produce per kilo of output, is going down from here, 22.6 to 22. So that's going down by 2.6%. So the methane per animal goes up, but because productivity goes up as well, and it goes faster up than the methane itself, the methane intensity actually goes down. So methane intensity is here not an objective trait in the index, but you can calculate it after you have used a linear index. So I did compare what if you reduced methane per head straight for this trait, single trait selection, and due to the correlations, all the other traits go backward as well. And you see that for that strategy, the methane intensity actually goes up. So Mark talked earlier about, you can also select for methane intensity. That I tested that on this index as well. So then methane intensity goes a bit more down. But the profitability doesn't go up as much. And that is back to what Mark said, and I have a similar result here. So we talked about lambda earlier, and if lambda is below 1, then the denominator is dominant. So that's basically the productivity in this case. How much lamb do you produce per ewe? So that's, you can also read it as how much milk do you produce per cow. So if you have lambda values below 1, and Mark showed for milk it was even here, if you select on the ratio, like on intensity, you see that, so you select for lower ratios, that the denominator, which is productivity, goes up a lot, and methane itself also goes up, but it goes less up if the correlation is lower. Yeah, so basically, the productivity trait or the product trait has more variation, so you pull harder on the denominator than the numerator, because a ratio can be changed in two ways. You can increase productivity or decrease methane, and what most happens for the examples that we looked at, you increase productivity, and methane goes up with it, but that would be less so if the correlation was lower. So that's the blue trait here. And so that's exactly what we see here. And the response in the production traits is not that dependent on that correlation, but the response in the methane is very dependent on the correlation, because the production is driven firstly, it has more value and more variation. It has more variation. The methane goes with it, but less so if the correlation is lower. So I think that's an important point that Mark kind of showed in a similar way, but this is probably for that example quite useful. So we have to look at not per head maybe, but we have to probably look at per flock. And as a national aim, we have to look at what do we do as a country, for example, as a world maybe. So in Australia, they have now 35 million breeding ewes. They produce so much lamb, they eat so much feed, and they produce so much methane. So if we just select for more profit per head, we would actually produce a lot more lamb in the next 20 years. We also would produce more methane. If you select on less methane per head, we would have less methane. That would be good. The government would be happy, but we also would hardly produce any product anymore because we go backward. So methane intensity is more similar to selecting for profit. So we have to imagine that we want to reduce methane, and I just did an example where there's a cap on the total methane we can produce with our sheep in Australia, apart from giving them maybe feed additives or whatever. So if it has to go down by 33%, so we go from 15 to 10, then we could produce the same amount of lamb, but with just many fewer animals. If we didn't do anything, we also could reduce the number of animals. No, we would have to reduce the number of animals to reduce methane, but with selection we can make so that even fewer animals can make the same product, and we have the same amount of methane. So if you select it against methane per head, we would get very little output in 20 years, still reach that goal here. So what this shows you is basically, if you want to increase methane intensity, and if you want to produce less methane as a country from your flock, you just have to reduce the number of animals and make them a lot more productive, rather than decrease methane per animal and make them less productive, such that, because then you don't end up with any food anymore. So reducing methane emissions is mainly through improvement of productivity and the reproduction rate in sheep. So efficiency is the main driver, and that's very similar to increasing feed efficiency. The best way to increase feed efficiency is to select for fast-growing animals. And then you can do a bit more, of course, if you measure feed intake, but you're not going to select animals that eat less. So a linear index is the easiest, most transparent approach. It's very hard to have desired gains and proper economic values if you play around with ratio traits in your breeding objective. And so you could just include methane per head and then use your model, your flock model or so, to work out how that affects intensity and see what you want. So the relative weight has to probably be determined by desired gains rather than economic values, because at the moment those economic values are way too low, but we can maybe speculate how much they will be higher in 10 years. So it's a bit similar in a way to selecting for milk production and reproduction. You do economic values, you just produce more milk and dairy cows become less reproductive, but if you put a bit more weight, you can find a sweet spot that improves both. So that's the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Julius. Are there questions for Julius?
I see a few in the, it's methane per head. I see a few in the chat.
Yeah.
It's how much methane you produce per day was with the trait that I used. But how much you produce per day per animal, per breeding animal. Yeah, so if they have more lambs, then the amount of methane per breeding ewe goes up because the lambs are counted towards the breeding ewe.
Donna, do you have a new one, or is that related to your question comment in the chat?
Yeah, same question, but Julius, if by slowing down the rate of improvement in, say, growth rate, the animal is burping less methane per day, but burping for more days.
Yeah, that's true. Well, that's accounted for. Like typically, you have to define your traits. Is it for a certain to a certain end weight or to a certain amount of days grown or so? So I used an economic model that I think slaughtered at a given age. But anyway, you can always make an economic model that does one or the other. The point is still that you use less methane per unit of growth if you select against it, because there's genetic variation. So, yeah. But from what you said, that's exactly the reason why you don't want to lose productivity, because productivity is a big component of reducing the amount of methane that you produce per output.
So yeah, I agree. You won't lose productivity, but I would be fearful, especially when you talk about carbon and not just methane, that you would lose or slow down the improvement in productivity by taking
Yes, you do,
selective
and that, yeah. So in those pictures that I showed about how you find a balance, for each of those outcomes, you can work out how much carbon you produce as a farm. But of course, the important thing is are you doing it per fixed amount of animals? Are you doing it for the fixed output or for the fixed amount of feed that you have? Because typically, if your animals become more productive, well, usually we keep the same amount and produce more, and we also produce more methane. But as a whole, we can't do both. We can't, as a world, keep on producing more product and without having more methane. That's quite hard, of course. But what we can do is make sure that the methane that we produce for the amount of product is minimized. So that is kind of methane intensity, but without putting methane intensity itself in the selection index, because if you do that, it doesn't pull economic. It doesn't pull what you want to pull. So I had that slide where if you select on methane intensity, the intensity actually was maximized, but the profit was declining. So you have to find a balance between those two.
Oscar?
Thank you, Julius, for the presentation. In your last slide, you said that the simple way would be to select for dry matter intake and methane emissions directly. Does it also include residual traits? So it will be better to select on those traits than residual traits. This is like a huge conversation and discussion that many people is having. So could you comment on that?
Well, for residual traits, you have a long history of residual feed intake. And we've also shown that if you select on residual feed intake and growth is exactly the same as selecting on feed intake and growth. You just have to change the economic values a bit. So, but that index is totally equivalent. We have a bit similar situation with ratio traits. If you select on the ratio of feed and growth, that's together with growth is the same as selecting on just feed and growth. So that's what I put in that World Congress paper. But again, you have to adjust the economic values, and that's very complicated for ratio traits to get at equivalent. And I'm pretty sure, I mean, we know that pig people have selected for many years on feed conversion ratio, but whether those economic values were done correctly, I'm not so sure. I mean, the economic values is, of course, only what you want is some kind of desired gains that gives you outcomes that you want, right? And that's not just economics often. And I'm sure pig breeding companies have worked like that for many years. But like the other question is also something in between. Well, I was trying to show that you can balance the two, and where the sweet spot is a bit up to what you want as in your breeding program, I think. Like in Australia, we did economic values for fertility, and if we selected on those, fertility would decline a lot. So we just quadrupled the economic weight on that trait so that it wouldn't go down. And I think we have to do something similar with methane.
Thank you.
Next is Raphael.
Thank you, Julius, for a very good presentation. So, and from your conclusion, what do you think that maybe if we use a restricted selection index approach, would that not give you a similar result to, I mean, your last slide where you hold in methane constant?
Yeah.
In that case, we can fix methane at a particular level, we restrict it while we allow production to increase or other productive traits to increase while we put a restriction on the amount of methane. Would that give you a equivalent result to your conclusion?
Yeah. Restricted index is a form of desired gains index. So I suppose I'm promoting a desired gains index, put the weights on such that you get the outcomes that you want. But we have to, but again, a linear selection index approach is the best way play around with that. If you have this ratio traits or residual traits, well, certainly ratio traits, residual traits is a bit more similar. It's much harder to put those restrictions and desired gains to implement it in your indexes. But linear indexes are made to do so, and we have lots of good ways to do that. So that should be a problem.
Yeah, but you can put a restriction even on a linear index, and it doesn't really mean it's a play around with economic weights and also desired gain. But I think it's more maybe more flexible than maybe whereby you have your genetic correlations and also the economic weights, and you can put a weight, say, I don't want methane to change from this level, and then drive the other traits on in terms of increasing their productivity. That maybe another flexible way to look at it.
Yeah, but what would you propose to restrict in your restricted index? Is that the methane per animal, or what would you, or because if you optimize things per animal, then you have to restrict the response to methane per animal should not go up, and that implies a certain cost to how much you can go up this productivity. But of course, you can also have fewer animals to produce the same product, and then you also reduce methane. So if you do it per fixed output, then you optimize your system in a different way. So I'm kind of arguing we shouldn't optimize per animal; we should optimize per unit of product. On the short term, maybe per hectare. But farms can sell land if they have more productive animals and they need less feed to produce the same output. Then they can sell some land and build houses on it. So I think on the long term, you want to optimize per output, both profit and methane.
Thank you. Roel?
Yeah, I'm trying to summarize for myself what the consequences if you use a ratio trait. So I'm looking from the perspective of a breeder. Is it right that if you go for the ratio trait, you can actually, if I look at the scenario that Mark represented, you can still increase methane per animal, but you increase productivity per animal much faster. But then you have to tell the breeder, yeah, but you have to start milking less cows or having less animals if you want to stay neutral for methane. So in the long term, you are slowly reducing the number of animals, and that could be an economic strategy. But is that true for the ratio trait? And I'm also thinking about what is the competitive advantage from a company investing or a breeder starting to take an interest in methane, but then just they might as well just ignore the whole business and start selecting for milk yield. So,
well, rule that, as I said, you can have an index where a ratio trait is part of it, and it can be totally equivalent of having the component traits. But I've played around with economic values for a ratio trait in the breeding objective, and that's pretty hard. And there's a very big chance that you double count, because the principle of a breeding objective is what's the value of improving a trait if the other does not improve. So if I have, say, feed conversion ratio, which is feed over growth, and the other trait is growth, then the economic value of the ratio is such that growth cannot change and feed intake has to change. That means that only so the ratio has to be changed by the economic value is the value of changing feed intake. But the economic value of growth is such that what's the value of improving growth such that the ratio does not improve. And that's quite complicated. Like you can work it out, but this is a simple trait with two components. But if you do methane per kilo of land produced or so, kilo of land produced is the product of lots of traits. It's going to be horrible to work out economic values for. Like one cannot change and the other. So one can change. Those are partial derivatives. One trait changes at a time. That's really difficult for ratio traits. So that's my main argument. But we talked today a bit about. So we know with residual traits, if you have EBVs for traits, you can actually present them by just having post-analysis transformations. So breeding value for residual feed intake is the breeding value of feed intake minus the genetic regression times the breeding value for production traits, right? So it's possible that something like that could happen for ratio trades. If people really feel comfortable with ratio trades, I would argue you could have a post-analysis transformation. I haven't worked out yet exactly if that is possible, but maybe it is. And that's indeed like, what kind of trades do people feel more comfortable with? But we have to be able to at least optimize it properly and not double count economic values in the breeding objectives and so on.
Because you also have less observations for methane, and it's just
Yeah,
very
but
frustrating. It's very
But that comes
frustrating.
out in a that comes out in a wash, right? So if I don't have a methane trade measured, I can not measure methane in my index, but I can also not put methane intensity in my index. So that I just have the other trades. So that's actually the same. It's more.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm also comparing with breeders who don't have methane versus the breeders who do have methane. So how do you show your long-term competitive advantage? And if
Well, I
you,
mean, first of all, I assume that most people that do selection have a genomic test as well. And there will be some reference. So even if you didn't measure anything on your flock or on your herd, you can still predict breeding values as long as you do DNA testing. But yeah, some have more information than others. That's true. But that's with selection index. Well, with all indexes, that's the case, right? And those predictions of how much gain you get are kind of average across what a typical, what on average happens in the population in terms of accuracy and information that you have per EBV. So there will always be a bit of variation, of course, depending on what information you actually have to select. But the difference is disappearing a bit with genomics, I think, because like in dairy with a DNA test, all traits are quite accurate. And it's a very nice population that's very low effective size, so predictions will work very well.
but not all AI companies have a breeding value for methane or a genomic prediction.
No, that's true.
So
Yeah,
then
so
the
that's
question,
why I showed what you can do depends on how much information you have for the trades, right? So I had this example where if you have no information, the correlation is much higher, and it's much harder to find a good balance than if you have some information.
yeah, but for the company who has it, they can do it, and they should benefit from it by showing where the animals are. But if they just keep on selecting for milk yield because that's easier to sell, then what's the point of the whole exercise?
No, but those companies will have more sires that have a high index for yield and also not too high index for methane. So you have more choices in the top sires there for index of animals that have a bit lower methane. If you didn't have methane information, then by definition the top ones will always have a high methane EBV. Yeah, so that's the two pictures that I showed. You remember? Rob.
Good, Rob, that's the last question. We are already past one, so very short.
Very quickly, Julius, the way you present the results for change in profit and change in methane makes it seem as though there's no value to the farmer of reducing methane. I don't know whether that's what you're saying or not, but surely if farmers get a payment for reducing methane, that's part of their profit value.
Yeah. Well, what I showed for sheep was I used a methane economic value of $40 per carbon. So I calculated how much gain you made and how the flock changed for so much CO2 for the flock to how much more they got. So that there was a cost to it if you got more, and there's a benefit if you have less methane. So I did have an economic value for methane, but as I said, the current price we have in Australia is about $40 per ton per ton carbon. That doesn't do very much in indexes because it's just too low.
I get that. I think that's going to be an important point to explain, that the farmer is getting paid for the methane reduction. Yeah. It's a bit of presenting it as over here is profit and over here is methane makes it seem like maybe they're not getting paid for reducing methane. But I think you're saying in your model they are.
Yeah, they are. I probably did not present it clearly, but yeah. But the thing, what they are being paid now is just not enough to drive
I
it
get
very
the
far.
point about whether it's enough. It's whether they're getting paid for it at all.
Okay.
In your model. So, thank you.
Thanks a lot for both Julius and Mark for presenting first results of the project, the selection index part. And thank you all for contributing with comments and questions to both of them. As said, well, if you want to join the other webinars dealing with this topic here, then just reach out to gmg@wo.nl, and then you will be, we will send you the link to join. And yeah, thanks a lot for joining today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Birgit, will we get the comments because
Sorry?
you get those comments, right? It would be because there's a lot in there that I have to
We'll comment and also answer some. There, 1 or 2 questions are still not answered in the chat. I think that would be nice if we can do that. So,
yeah. Thanks.
Good.
Thanks, Birgit.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.